Morning, everybody. It's a grey, dank Monday here on Oxford Street. So it's episode 2 of the 7-part series, the 7 deadly sins of talent development. Might even become more than 7, but anyway, let's go with that. So today we're going to be talking about comparison. So this weekend, interesting weekend, full of sport. Lots of stuff going on from my perspective. Lots of international sport. Interesting finish to the Six Nations. Not the best from England's perspective. That whole bittersweet feeling of winning a championship but not quite completing the job, the Grand Slam job. But more importantly than that, we had the under-10s hockey tournament this Sunday, and my teams were playing, a group of under-10s that I'm coaching on a regular basis, and this is actually a good starting point for the conversation about comparison, because one of the interesting things about it was I was having some conversations with parents and coaches and some of the spectators as well afterwards, and some of the conversations went like this: we just don't seem to be as good as these other teams, or these other teams they've got these players who are really, really talented, or really, they've got loads of, and our players don't seem to be as good as those. What can we do about it? Do we need to do summer training? Do we need to do do we need to do more longer sessions, or do we need to focus more on playing matches, so that they get used to playing matches and training them to win those games? These were the sorts of conversations I was having, and found it quite difficult actually to have those kinds of conversations, because there's a part of me that sort of agrees, because the players we have just aren't as good as some of the players in the other teams. Some of the players in the other teams were far more advanced, both technically, physically, certainly physically, and they really had they had the edge. They really sort of played in kind of almost like a different way. So I'm thinking to myself, well, how do we deal with this? And I've been reflecting on it a lot over the weekend, yesterday and subsequently, and I sort of come to the conclusion that this is one of the problems we face is that around us, talent tends to be based around comparisons. So the idea of talent identification actually is just another word for talent selection, or actually, more accurately, talent deselection. Because let's face it, when it comes to selecting players to be part of a talent squad or a representative team or even a club team, it's always based. There's more people who get deselected than there are who get selected. So that's obviously one of those things that's a bit of a challenge. But we call it talent identification because it's got a lot more positive connotations, hasn't it? Talent de-identification might be a more accurate description of it. But in this context, talent identification is also, a way of comparing. So what do we do? So in order to identify talent, we observe the abilities of a group of individuals, whether we like it or not. We make judgments and decisions about their abilities, and those judgments and decisions, based on what we observe, are how we identify, in inverted commas, talent. The problem is that quite often we've got an incomplete picture, and what I mean by that is the picture, we don't know enough about each individual to be able to make some accurate judgments. So for example, in my context, some of the players who were playing there were really, really good, but some of them had a significant physical advantage. You could see, they were very big, very athletic, very strong. So that's obviously one major plus point when you're up against children who are much smaller. The second factor was a lot of the children in my teams. It's a 2-year age band, so we're playing within the under 10s, and most of the children in my group were 9, and they were playing up against children who in some cases were 18 months older, both physically, mentally, etc., etc. So that's a significant challenge as well, because you're up against they're not competing at the same against the same sort of level. So that's a bit of a problem. And then the other aspect as well is that what's the sort of developmental background of these players? So I know in my case, most of the children we have within the club are not privately educated, and they get an hour and a half hockey a week through the training that we provide within the club. And yet pretty clear to me that many of the children, not all, but many of the children in the other teams were privately educated, who will be doing 3 or 4 sessions a week. So the amount of time on task between, or not time, in kind of training environments is significantly less between one group and the other. So you might have one group where a group of children have had, several hundred hours of training, several thousand in some cases, hours of practice and time playing in an environment which fosters that and ongoing play. And you've got a different environment for this group of children who are getting much less time. So there's bound to be significant differences. And then the final piece is, even if they haven't been educated in different settings, there's lots of other variables that can be thrown into the mix. So for example, you might have a group of children who've got older siblings who play the sport, and as a result, are constantly surrounded by guidance and advice and opportunities to play with older brother, and there is a significant correlation with so-called talented or high-performing athletes and being part of be the youngest of a family, because it drives on the idea to try and catch up, or to play with the older ones, which advances their abilities. So all of these different abilities, all these different different backgrounds and different experiences that people have, means that you can't compare. You're not comparing apples with apples, because they've all had a massively different background. And it's only if you can build a much clearer picture that you're able to make those kinds of judgments effectively. And even then, I think it's still very, very difficult, particularly the younger the children are, to be able to make those decisions, because these variables are still going to affect them as they move forward, changes in circumstance and all those sorts of things. So comparison can be really evil, because it drives us to do things that may not be in the best interest of the children, or the best interest of the young people. We might be driven to do more training. One of the suggestions from one of the parents is, let's run coaching sessions all year round. Let's do summer training so that they get more time. Now that might be a perfectly valuable suggestion. It also might just encourage early specialisation, because now we've got children doing one sport all year round, so they're going to have to probably sacrifice some other sport that they might do. As well as that, rather than the sport being a seasonal sport, they're playing all year round, so it kind of loses its specialness, and therefore they start to get a bit bored of it and look for something else. So actually, by breaking up the season, they start to look forward to the football or the hockey or the rugby season, and then when they're starting to get a little bit burnt out and tired towards the end of the season, a new sport comes along and they start to play summer sports, or tennis, whatever it might be they want to play. and those sorts of things mean that they've got a nice balance and they're getting a good mix of sporting experiences rather than being too forced too early into that single sport, which we know causes all sorts of athletic deficiencies, which drives burnout, increases the chances of long-term injury, etc., etc. So comparison's a real issue for us, and we have to try and fight it a little bit and constantly say, that the fact that there are players with different abilities is something that we shouldn't necessarily use right now as a way to identify where they are on the developmental journey, because the developmental journey is quite a long one. It takes time. We have to allow it to happen, and this drives me the other thing. So comparison also drives us to be in a big hurry. So what's the hurry? What's the rush? Why do children have to become performers, have to be able to perform at some sort of level of ability? Why do they have to do that at 9? Why is that a big deal? Because we're in this for the long game, aren't we? We're in this to help them develop over a period of time, and if we rush it, chances are we won't get it right. We've got to get them to fall in love. We've got to have the process right. We've got to get them falling in love with the journey that they're going on. We've got to get them bought into the idea of continuous development, continuous improvement, week to week, session to session, all that sort of stuff, and then see where they end up, see what happens to them, see how they develop. But we're almost using these comparisons continuously as benchmarks to say, if you're not as good as such and such, you're behind. You've got to catch up. You've got to work harder. It happens in education all the time. You have standardized testing, and if such and such isn't as good, or at the same level as other people within the class, right, alarm bells start ringing. Right, we've got to get tutors. We've got to get them to catch up. We've got to get them to be at the same level. But children don't develop like that. It's not a linear process. Every child's different, and they all have different developmental windows. Some of them go through bursts of ability or bursts of physical development which help them, to be able to perform. Some of them move, some of them seem like they're not going very far, don't really seem like they're going, and then all of a sudden, boom, something happens and they fly and they really, really move on. I've seen that in lots of cases. So I think this whole issue of comparison causes us some real problems. We've got to really put it into context, and yes, okay, let's make sure that let's create benchmarks and allow our children to progress, and let's find ways to actually navigate them through that. But let's make that individualised, let's make that personal to them, so that we are tracking their improvement, because really the only thing we should care about in a world of talent is that, are they improving from where they are now? Have they improved by the next stage? And how can we show that, evidence that? How can we give that clarity? And if we use their own individual markers and then help them develop against their own individual markers, we'll see them actually progressing. And then we won't start putting all sorts of crazy pressure on ourselves, on them, in order to try and get them to be something that they currently aren't. And we won't use negative, either subconscious or overt language that makes them think they're not good enough, makes them think that they're not as effective as their players, because children do that. They're constantly evaluating themselves against the abilities of their peers, and if they think they're not as good as somebody else, that can kind of stick with them, that can stay with them, they can believe it, they can really think, oh, I'll never be as good as such and such. So we have to almost counter that to say, actually, the only way you will reach your potential or get anywhere near it is just to fall in love with the process of getting better. Just try each time, get better, try as hard as you can and fall in love with the process. And then we'll see where they develop. And we have to constantly reaffirm that, because they are constantly being given comparisons elsewhere. So my big thing for the adults surrounding these young talented individuals, my big message is, avoid the comparison trap. Avoid saying or even indicating to anybody, to children, that they're not as good at, because they're going to be bombarded with that anyway, and really guide them towards the only comparison they should make is their comparison of themselves last week. have they gone better or made some developmental improvement from last week that we can touch on and we can show that they're moving towards, and that will help them on that journey of development. So there you go. There's my Monday morning rant over. Tune in this time next week for episode 3. I'm not so sure which one it is yet. There's a series to come, but yeah, we'll be talking about the 3rd of the 7 deadly sins this time next week, and speak to you then. Bye.